Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Salam Media. I'm Mariam Jooma, sitting in for Inayat Wadi, and I welcome you to a jam-packed show this evening. Today we're diving into the topic of US soft power in Africa, specifically how it shapes the work of NGOs, media, and the perception of American influence across the continent. When we talk about soft power, we're referring to a nation's ability to attract and persuade rather than to coerce. And for the US, Africa has long been a key focus of this strategy. From funding for development projects to partnerships with local media organizations, the United States often presents itself as a champion of democracy, human rights, and economic progress. While many US backed NGOs help in the areas of healthcare, education, and anti corruption, there's still a complex layer out there. With the influence comes a set of narratives and values that shape South African society in ways that sometimes clash with local priorities and perspectives. This evening, we've got three experts from three different areas: the NGO sector, as well as the media, and I would like to say from the political sector as well, as both Roscoe and Phillip Dexter are also members of political parties. They have a particular interest in this topic. And we have Angelo Fick, who is the Director of Research at ASRI, which is the Owl Institute for Research. And he'll be discussing issues around the ideological impetus and media imperialism aspect of this. Welcome to all our guests this evening.
Thank you.
Okay, so Philip, if I could perhaps start with you first. You've written quite a hard-hitting piece recently regarding the influence of US money with regard to NGOs and in the media. How do you view the balance between foreign influence and local agency in South Africa, and particularly in the media, and how does it shape soft power narratives?
Well, I think that, well, first of all, thanks for inviting me to be on the panel. Most appreciated. I think that the term that you're using, soft power, is probably a bit of a misnomer, because I think this is only one part of the strategy. I think that what we've seen in the last 5 to 10 years is a very aggressive move by foreign interests, and in particular the USA, to influence South African politics towards regime change. And I've no doubt in my mind that should they have failed with bringing the ANC below 50% in the last elections, there were other options, as we're seeing in Mozambique and other countries on the continent, where there's an attempt to overthrow liberation movements. But I think the important point is, as you've said, is that there is this presence of these interests. And what is disturbing is that they wield huge influence and power in relation to money and funding. And that, for me, is the problem. This Conference for Democracy, which, if one thinks about it, is really quite ironic that this should be something that's being convened by people who support the overthrow of legitimately elected regimes. But in any case, this conference is purely driven by funds and money, and unfortunately a number of South African organizations have fallen for it, as it were, and are participating or have claimed that they will participate. Fortunately, we've seen a number pull out, but I think the balance is very much one in which we as citizens of South Africa are on the back foot, and we are under enormous pressure from these funds from abroad to shape and influence the agenda of South African politics.
Thank you, Philip. I think you've raised quite an interesting aspect with regard to, unloading the concept of soft power. We've looked at things like Russian influence and Chinese influence, and even today we have the former Turkish foreign minister in South Africa talking about Turkey's influence in Africa. So it seems to have always been something that the other party does. It's not what the West does in terms of influencing ideologically. How do you see the National Endowment for Democracy and its funding of media initiatives in South Africa?
Well, as you said, all countries try to influence each other. That's part of international relations. And We as South Africans should have no fear of that. But that's done openly through diplomacy, through open initiatives where everybody knows what the interests are. What we're seeing here is something different because the National Endowment for Democracy, as anybody can just Google on the internet and see, was set up to channel funding that was initially used through the CIA in an attempt to overthrow foreign governments based on the US's own determination of its international interests. When the CIA was caught out in a number of countries doing this, the NED was founded and money was channeled into the NED as a kind of conduit to do this under the banner of it being an NGO or somewhat an independent operator. But everybody knows it's CIA money, and we see it filtering through to the press, the media, and into other avenues of life in South Africa and in other countries. And this money is used primarily to sponsor an agenda that is in the interests of the United States of America. And that is completely and utterly iniquitous, because why should the USA be able to use money secretly, without declaring it, to shape the agenda of what we read in the press and the media, and to shape the agenda of civil society organizations and political parties in our country? We're a sovereign nation. It's up to South Africans to determine those things. As an example, I'm not particularly comfortable with the GNU, but I recognize that that's an outcome of South African political parties sitting around the table and negotiating that. What lies behind that GNU, is another thing, because how did we get there and who influenced the way in which voting happened in our country and resources were used to mobilize people to vote is another thing.
Thank you, Phillip. I think this helps us move on to Roscoe quite nicely, because he's also written quite a few articles on this. And Roscoe, could you give us your perspective on how concretely the narrative that is pro-US has affected South African reporting? Could we perhaps look at the coverage of the elections and tell us a bit more about whether or not you feel that has actually provided some kind of a concrete outcome?
Well, thank you for having me on the show, and I find myself in, following, a worthy expert in the machinations of the National Endowment for Democracy. Phillip, Dexter, and I wrote about media influence in South Africa, and as a consequence of that, I think we found ourselves sidelined and ostracized at first. But of late, we find more validation in the sense that more people are seeing the NED for what it actually is. So the National Endowment for Democracy, it was started in 1983. It's Carl Gershman was the first leader of that organization. And he survived, like the NED, it survived Democrat and Republican governments in the state. So this is not anything to do with a partisan view of the world. Always there's the primacy of the US's global political interests that is the one thing that there's multi-partisan consensus in America. In terms of so during the Cold War, the NED was involved in crushing dissent, or in the sense of where it would interfere in governments that would not be allied to America or advance its geopolitical interests. Here in South Africa, the NED founded things like the Continent, which is the Mail and Guardian's continent-wide publication, WhatsApp only. And these things that it addresses things like what it deems to be disinformation, what it deems to be like good information. There's systemic patterns, where journalists to transition into roles within the NED or US linked operations. There's a revolving door between former Mail and Guardian editors who join NED funded programs to create long-term networks of influence. So I would say that now that people can see that NED conference that it's happening, the influence that it could have, and people recognizing that actually it's a pernicious threat in a way that let's say an analogous situation would be if the FSB had a similar organ of state effectively, and it had it said that it wants to expand Russian influence, and it's having this conference in South Africa, and all these NGOs for democracy would come on board. I mean, we'd see liberal heads exploding from Cape to Cairo. But that's not the case. So there is a liberal bias that's ingrained in how the instruments of US soft power is perceived, and also, in fact, welcomed by, I think, the liberal media establishment.
Roscoe, you've touched a little bit on this at the outset of your answer, but how has your reporting and Phillip's reporting been received? And how, I mean, I don't think very kindly, and how has that affected your journalism and as a career? Do you think it's had substantial impact on your upward mobility as a journalist?
Look, I'm not interested in upward mobility as a journalist. I think I write what I like effectively. But there is obviously, I won't, I would be amazed if I'm published in Daily Maverick, because it's their prerogative to publish who they like. Daily Maverick have been a particular front for some of the more, I would say, pro-Western narratives that have been crafted in South Africa. And this is manifested, I think, most starkly in the event of the Lady R, where this thing was fabricated out of whole cloth, elevated by a US diplomat, reported on his news, platformed onto other news channels like News 24, which went wall-to-wall coverage on a Saturday morning with Peter Toy making videos. You couldn't avoid it. And as it turns out, there was nothing on that. We weren't shipping arms to Russia. So this entire thing, in terms of creating a consensus, manufacturing a particular kind of narrative, that was one of the most egregious examples of that. And I don't think people have yet been held to account, because, I mean, the diplomatic price that we paid, the economic price that we paid to paint us into a corner like that, it was, we deserve an apology, and I believe we deserve reparations for the economic costs that we were caused by the what was presented to be errant comments from a diplomat. But because he's never received any sanction, it's quite clear that those comments were sanctioned in order to create diplomatic pressure on South Africa, both within and without.
I listened to a podcast you did with Ibrahim Rasool about a year ago, in which he actually admitted that it was probably just the US's way of giving South Africa a warning, and that the ambassador Brigadier actually knew that there would be no repercussions for him. So this is obviously using the media as another form of kind of interstate tete-a-tete, but without any real concrete forms of redress. Angelo, I'd like to bring you in now. Do you think, actually, Roscoe just said, I write what I like, and that obviously brings us back to Steve Biko. How do you see the idea of the US as an empire? I mean, Gaza has unmasked everything. Do you think there's still this ideological hegemony of US or Western kind of influence on our journalism? Or do we have an indigenous, if I could say, an authentic South African voice in the media space?
Good evening, and good evening to Phillip and to Roscoe. I don't think it is an either or. I think that there is no doubt that the United States is in a particular imperial or moment of imperial angst, with the political economy globally shifting, the bipolar world that has emerged in the wake of the Middle Eastern adventures of the United States and its Western partners, the formation of things like BRICS, has indicated that this is not a moment in which the United States has quite the unipolar power that it projected courtesy of people like Francis Fukuyama in the wake of the fall of the Soviet Union. But at the same time, I don't think it's just money influence in, South African media that results in the ways we see the world, we see ourselves in the world. There's also something to be said for the way in which people are educated into journalism, the way journalists are trained, where degrees in journalism count. And one thinks here of Edward Said, the late Palestinian-American professor, who indicated that what you need is not just media organizations that are speaking the kinds of ideological truths that we believe in our differences and diversity, but what you need are people who are able to be critically literate and engage that media. And the examples that Roscoe has brought up around the Russian ship docking in Simonstown is an example of being able to do that kind of hoaxing. One also thinks of the decouplets in a different paper. But it's able to perform these kinds of stories precisely because there is a population that, and this is one of the big tragedies of the post-apartheid state, hasn't been educated to be critically literate and to be able to filter out propaganda, lies, disinformation from proper information. And that's not just people who don't finish school. These are often our most highly educated people with PhDs, people with higher degrees, who often read the media, consume the media in ways that are highly uncritical if the media organization whose products they consume echoes the worldview they already have. And so I think whatever power the United States has to project versions of the world into the South African space is aided and abetted by local failures that we need to address, because we have some control over the local, we have less control over the global. And yes, it is execrable when organizations that are responsible for distributing information take money from sources without revealing those sources, but also I think part of the other side of that coin, and I want to finish here quickly, is that many of these issues are not the consequence of conspiracies in newsrooms. They're also often the result of very juniorization of reporting, lack of funds in the public broadcaster to present a counter-narrative to corporate media's version of the world. And very importantly, the selection of people. You asked Roscoe about the upward mobility that he had, and he denied it. But there are very many people who are selected for that upward mobility to become editors because they're going to make the kinds of decisions, they're going to say the kinds of things, they're going to choose stories that please the people who control the purse strings. And that's not just foreign purse strings, that's often local purse strings. Our corporate media are sectors, are subsidiaries of corporations that have interests in other sectors of the economy and very complex relationships to government. And so there are stories you'll never see on certain corporations' media outlets because, you're not going to have anti-gambling stories for a corporation that has gambling interests. You're not going to unearth the role of an Australian gambler in South African politics on channels that have similar kinds of investments with him, or you'll see it on those channels that are competing with that particular, organization for the right to do the gambling work in South Africa. And similarly for tobacco, alcohol, and a variety of industries. One thinks here of banking. The economic news that we get is often very pro-big business, very pro-banking on the mainstream channels. And not just because people conspire. Those are the big advertisers, or worse, the people who are hired to do economics journalism are people with degrees in mainstream economics who are not going to question the status quo, who are going to give you share price indices, who are going to give you sort of growth projections and disappointments, and are not going to look very deeply at issues of inequality, at the siphoning of profits into shareholders' pockets and not investing it into worker salaries. Those kinds of stories you'll very rarely see.
Well, that's actually a brilliant way to move on to our next part of the show, which we would like to look at, understanding to what extent journalism training has actually filtered down, because we have things like, SAPA having closed down almost 10 years ago, and we don't have an independent source of news that is almost neutral, that people can, agencies can draw from. Phillip, in your opinion, I mean, you've been in this industry for a long while now. How do you see, the death of SAPA? Do you think that that's actually made a very big impact on the media scene? And what can we do to kind of rectify this gap?
Loss to the sector as a whole, but to our democracy and to citizens. I think Angelo's points are very pertinent. We are focusing on this issue of the USA, but money, business, capitalism, both global and local, have interests, and they essentially control the media. So they control the narrative. I mean, they're powerful institutions like the Brenthurst Foundation, funded by the Oppenheimers. They've been central to this relationship with the NED and to this particular agenda that we're talking about. I think it's one of the reasons that organizations like Defend Our Democracy and the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation have found their way to be invited to and agreed to participate in this conference. And one would hope, as the Desmond Tutu Foundation withdrew today, that they would also see sense in withdrawing. Because the only way to combat or to counter these interests and their narratives is to create counter-narratives. And there, of course, training of journalists, creating independent institutions that are not prone to influence by funding are critical. And I think that's where the public broadcaster in particular should be playing a role. And we know all the problems that it has faced. But still, it does represent something of an alternative. As for whether it's a conspiracy, you see, I think conspiracies are interesting because you get outlandish conspiracies. But when you have a group of people who have a common agenda and they want to shape the narrative in a particular way for particular interests, that is by definition a conspiracy. And that's how class interests operate. So, as Angelo was pointing out, you've got big business, you've got the banking and financial sector, you've got those people who do still have some influence in print media and, and on the airwaves. And all of these are pushing a particular line. You'll never hear a counter narrative to why unemployment is still what it is. There'll just be the announcement of the figures, everyone will condemn the government, but there'll be no real in-depth discussion as to what are the structural reasons for this unemployment and what are the alternative policies that have to be pursued. So, the neoliberal agenda that shapes our economic thinking essentially closes down all discussion. And the journalists are complicit in that by and large. I'm not saying there aren't those individuals, brave individuals, who do speak out and who do write and who do find themselves marginalized, But by and large, the mainstream media has a particular view which it pursues. And I really believe that view supports the real power interests and money interests in our society. And that is a conspiracy.
Thank you, Phillip. We actually have a lot to talk about, but we're going to take a bit of an ad break. And when we get back, we can talk more about the AK Foundation and defending our democracy and understanding to what extent NGOs in South Africa are actually playing the role that they're meant to play. Thanks.
Thank you.
Supply motor spares and accessories for all makes and models of motor cars, LDVs, bakkies, trucks, and earth-moving equipment. We deliver on time, every time. Please contact us via WhatsApp on 014-592-0925 or call 014-592-0925 or visit 28 Zenderling Street, Rustenburg. Remember the name, Valley's Motor Spares.
Kids these days are smart, and when you're competing for their attention against their smartphones, you need to make smart choices, like using Sunfoil triple refined pure sunflower oil in every meal you make. It's naturally cholesterol-free and approved by the Heart and Stroke Foundation as part of a balanced eating plan. So whether you're cooking, frying, or baking, you get the great tasting results that'll get their attention faster than the latest app. And if that doesn't work, change the Wi-Fi password. Sunfoil. Now we're cooking.
When the perfect blend of stylish decor, exquisite halal cuisine, and warm hospitality come together, it could only mean Al Bayt Lodge, your true home away from home. Al Bayt is the ideal heaven for families, business people, and tourists with its 4-star family rooms and other luxurious facilities. Conveniently situated close to Port Elizabeth Airport, the beach, and other amenities, your stay will be truly unforgettable, as you'll be taking home lasting memories of the warm hospitality, the serenity and tranquility that Al Bayt has to offer. For reservations, call 041 583 6415 or visit www.albaytlodge.co.za.
Amman means safety. The Amman School of Excellence in Finetown, South Africa, is securing the futures of underprivileged children by providing world-class education in a safe and nurturing environment. Sponsor a child for only 15,000 Rand per year or any amount. A quality education at Amman presents a pathway out of poverty and a brighter future for South Africa.
Africa Muslims Agency, empowering, educating, inspiring.
Yasin Badat Financial Advisory. Are your financial goals feeling out of reach? Yasin Badat Financial Advisory is here to turn your aspirations into achievements. Our dedicated team, armed with a history of success, is ready to guide you through the complex nature of financial and investment planning. Whether you're a seasoned investor or new to the game, our personalized solutions cater to your unique goals and risk appetite. Trust in our commitment to transparency, integrity, and excellence. Ready to unlock a world of financial freedom? Partner with us today. Call Yasin Badat Financial Advisory at +27 33 346 2071 or visit www.yasinbadat.com. Yasin Badat Financial Advisory, guiding you to financial success.
Listen to something fresh. Listen to Salam Media.
Hey, Assalamu alaikum and welcome back. We're talking about the new features of media imperialism and soft power, looking at NGOs and the influence that their financiers and the ideology have on the South African media and NGO space. Welcome back to our guests, Roscoe Palm, Phillip Dexter, and Angelo Fick. Roscoe, I'm going to now kind of pick your brain a little bit, and I want to ask you about, the different tiers of media, the way we have it set up in South Africa, between public broadcasting, community journalism, community radio, and private. Do you think that this kind of setup actually helps the separation between interests, or has this also been kind of submerged in the monolithic hegemonic theory?
Well, we do have a diversity of media in South Africa, at least, and we can at least own to a rather, I would say, more politically aware citizenry than the United States of America. The most Googled question right after the election was, did Joe Biden drop out? So millions of Americans got to the polls, didn't see Biden's name, and then picked up their phones and Googled why Joe Biden wasn't on the ballot. I think radio in this country is massive. It's still, the country that has, and in fact, the continent where radio penetration is really big and very important. And I think because we have a public broadcaster that largely doesn't have a political agenda, whereas in the past they may have been accused of having such. But I think, if you look at the quality of the journalism and the quality of the information from our public broadcaster, that's good. I love community radio, and I wish there was more community radio stations. If there was some way to facilitate that and some kind of journalism on the ground as far as community radio, I think that would ameliorate a lot of the problems that Angelo brought up, where you're training journalists, and because training journalists, we can train journalists to in terms of the language that we speak and what it conveys. For example, the recent riots in Amsterdam were framed as anti-Semitic only after the fact. It was the broadcaster Sky News changed the entire story to depict what the Maccabi Haifa fans were saying is anti-Arab slogans, but what the counter-protesters were saying were anti-Semitic slurs. Similarly, in the Daily Maverick, I think right after the October 7th, there was an article in the Daily Maverick where it was referred to 2,700 Palestinians have died in the Israeli bombardment since Hamas, blah, 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 killed more than 1,300 Israelis on 7 October. So how this is framed is the Palestinians have died of what? Heart disease, natural death, but Israelis were killed. So, I mean, the disclosure, I think, is the most important part of this. Perhaps the journalist wrote and didn't want to avoid the repetition. So many Palestinians were killed, and so many Israelis were killed. But it's important disclosure that the head of technology of the Daily Maverick is also the president of the South African Zionist Federation. So whether that played a role where in terms of something implicit or explicit, at all times disclosure is important. But I think in general, coming back to your question about the importance of having different tiers of media, all of this is being now swallowed up by social media, which are basically farms for our personal data so that we can get served more and more ads by Mark Zuckerberg or the newly appointed hand of the king, Elon Musk, who is within the ensconced within the Republican government now of the United States of America. And I think that means that we have to put more money, we have to put more resources into community media where it exists and expand that footprint and keep up with creating content and building up credible media brands on social media.
Thank you, Roscoe. I think that also raises the question of what forms of redress do consumers of media have? I mean, in the sense that we are aware of the fact that the head of the Zionist Federation is also part of the Daily Mavericks tech team. To what extent, where do we go to say, look, this is a complete conflict of interest? How do we address this? I mean, does a media ombudsman, in your view, does it actually do that job?
No, I don't think so. I don't think you can tell somebody that the head of technology, tell Branko Burkic that you're not allowed to have this guy as the head of technology for the Daily Maverick. But disclosure is always good. You know, if you buy a packet of knickknacks or anything, there has to be some element of disclosure about how much harmful salt or polyunsaturated fats in the thing. Similarly, you need to know, okay, these are the key stuff, these are their interests that they hold, these are the organizations that they are part of or within the management of, so that at least you have that disclosure. The similar thing is asked of public representatives, where they have to disclose their interests so that people can know that the decisions that they are taking are motivated by what is, in the common interest, not within their interest. So I think, the independent media here in South Africa, on the online white English liberal media, it is very much holds itself within this bubble above accountability for these standards. It's accountability for thee, but not for me when it comes to them. As much as they say that, look, we disclose this, that, the other thing, they do the bare minimum of disclosure that no ombudsman or no, I think, act of parliament passed would be able to remedy. But as long as there is some kind of mechanism to disclose, and I think that we can pass legislation as far as that's concerned. And I think it's important to pass that legislation, but to do it in as careful manner as we possibly can.
Thank you. I think now, Angelo, you might be the best person to answer this question in the sense that it's looking at the historical sweep of US involvement in South Africa. How do you think the history affects South Africa's perception of the CIA? I mean, when you say the word CIA, immediately it's a Bond movie or it's it's Hollywood. Yet it has very tangible impacts on our NGO space and media space. Do you find that journalists in South Africa are more likely to challenge the US narrative because of the historical context of the US involvement in South Africa?
So I don't know if one can say that South African journalists were able to do this, because there are varieties of journalistic traditions. And so there will be people who will ask critical questions about, and did ask critical questions about, the US ambassador's statements about the docking of the ship at Simonstown. And then there were other organizations that simply ran with his version and did not challenge it. And that's bad journalism. And here I think the Press Council of South Africa does play a role, because many of those organizations are signatories to it, just as if the Broadcasting Complaints Commission of South Africa is active. And I think it is important for citizens and residents to take the duty of the Constitution, its obligation on us, to be active citizens and lay complaints at these particular organizations around news that we do not think is fair. And I can tell you, as a former employee of a broadcaster, we often went to the Broadcasting Complaints Commission of South Africa for complaints often made by fairly conservative and right-wing elements who were very meticulous in their complaints. And so there are conservative elements in our society that do use these fora. And those of us who identify as progressive or interested in greater freedom have to play that role. I don't think, though, that only disclosure is going to result in better media. I think it is also important that we have better readers of media, better listeners, and better viewers. And for that, what you need is not just some sort of alternative education program. You actually need to create critically literate citizens. As somebody who did live in a totalitarian state, which often forgets that it was a totalitarian state, in apartheid South Africa, yes, you had alternative sources of information like Grassroots and South, but you were also being educated to understand that the SABC is a state broadcaster, and therefore, when the SABC is compromised in post-apartheid South Africa, habits I learned when I was 12 and 13 about how to watch television news simply kick back in. So when the BBC gets compromised under the Tory government, the way in which I watch BBC News shifts because I have this education. I think it's important to recognize that that has been a failure of the post-apartheid state, to create critically literate citizens who could engage with compromising and compromised media. And then Roscoe raises the issue of social media. And there, I think streaming services and platforms that are not tax-paying in South Africa, but have access to the space and able to influence the politics, is a very crucial element where government has to begin to regulate. And ICASA has begun to proceed through Parliament with attempting to do that. We've just seen Brazil have to shut down the ability of X to operate in its space for failing to adhere to local regulations. And what ICASA wants is for spaces like Facebook and its parent company Meta or X to adhere to the rules that it is subjected to in the European Union when it operates in South Africa, because precisely that is the European Union, for all of its very problematic elements, is a space in which those who live inside its boundaries are very much protected by their governments. And similarly, the South African state has a role to protect its citizens from outside influence, particularly when that outside influence has access to the market but is not tax-paying. Secondly, I think the three tiers of community have their own risks. I don't agree that we have a good public broadcaster. We have a potentially good public broadcaster that is compromised by underfunding, sometimes political interference, juniorization of staff, and a variety of other problems. Community radio stations, community media, very important for local stories, but again, high risk activity, because these are people who are very easily targeted in a country in which violence often also gets rid of people who are inconvenient speakers of the truth. And corporate media, I think, arose precisely because of the compromise of the public broadcasters. So some of our corporate media played the de facto role of a public broadcaster when the actual public broadcaster was at its most compromised. However, as things shift in the economy, they've become more and more fronts for the businesses that actually own them. So you'll have a private corporation using trade union members' money and pension funds to establish a channel in which you see very little pro-trade union, pro-worker activity, and in which the workers themselves are often also treated quite badly, in which somebody could say, I will not have a trade union at my channel, even though that channel happened to have been founded by trade union money. So those kinds of moments are, I think, part of what the compromise is in South Africa. Now, if the post-apartheid state had actually done proper education and not just poor quality education where 80% of 10-year-olds can't read for meaning in any language over a 10-year period, then it would matter much less. The tragedy would be infinitely less appalling because people would have the tools to engage, stories about Lady Ass, stories about the decuplets, stories about a variety of other issues, and say, well, that's clearly false, or that's clearly skewed, or that's clearly in one interest. They'd be able to listen to these indices being read about the economy and say, well, these people keep talking about growth, but actually growth is not the solution on a planet with finite resources. They would be, agitating through the BCCSA and the press ombudsman and letters to editors to see greater amounts of coverage that's scientifically informed about the unfolding climate catastrophe through which we live. But because you have this population, Edward Said's warning from 1997 in Al Rahram Weekly in Egypt has come to pass, that you have now millions of people in South Africa. He predicted or warned against billions of people globally who are at the mercy of these peddlers of misinformation and disinformation.
Phillip, what do you think about the fact that actually social media has actually exposed everything that's happening in Gaza, fully? We'll be seeing the live pictures of the genocide, and yet there is no action. So perhaps, someone would say that what's the point? Whether you have the right information or not, nothing happens. How do you see this? And you mentioned the Brenthurst Foundation. What is the role of organizations like that have money behind them in stymieing any kind of real progress?
Well, look, I think, the social media, what can we call it, conundrum is an interesting one. Because on the one hand, it does give the opportunity for everybody to have access to information. But the question is, what information? How do we know what is true? How do we know what is fake news, etc., etc.? And I think Angelo's point is the crucial one, because we cannot have censorship in the crude form. I think there should be some standards for everything that's published, and that's why, as Roscoe said, disclosure is important, because people are writing things. We should know who they are and what they stand for, because they present themselves as independent, as a journalist. But we know, for example, that they've had a huge farm funded for them by the Brenthurst Foundation, which is factually true. That has happened in one instance. Then we would know that, well, this person's agenda is not clearly one of independence, because they've been bought, they've been captured, to use the word that we like to use these days, because capture doesn't only relate to government people. So I think disclosure, like members of parliament have to disclose, journalists should absolutely have to disclose who they paid by, what they earned, etc., and the normal kind of things. But when it comes to social media, it is tricky. But I think Angelo's points about things like the Ombud, the press councils, and legislation are crucial. And Roscoe was right to say we don't want to be heavy-handed with legislation, because one doesn't want to censor and intimidate journalists from doing legitimate work. But there have to be consequences for people printing falsehoods. And I mean, the Lady R was a good example that Roscoe brought up. The other example, if you look at this Conference for Democracy, the mainstream media hasn't really publicized it at all, whether in a positive or negative sense, because the agenda is clearly that this thing should happen behind closed doors, like the other conferences that were funded by the NED and the Brenthurst Foundation, the one in Poland and the one that happened in the Marx building, where they brought together, particular political organizations on the African continent to host them, to work out a program. And I think, again, disclosure is crucial, and the public needs to know about these things. What Angelo said, I think, for me, though, captures it. One is education, both of the public and of journalists, because I think better educated journalists, a better educated public who have the ability to read and think critically is the first line of defense against falsehoods. The second is awareness, and that's alternatives. You create awareness by giving different points of view to citizens so that they can make up their own mind. Then I would argue those of us who have a political view or agenda, we have to develop a program of action. In relation to this conference, a few of us have been mobilizing to say, let's stop organizations from going. Let's lobby them so that we can collapse the conference. But it's not mobilization of a mass base of people. And I think that that's the crucial point. You want to get citizens involved. They should be mobilized, whether it's mobilized to comment, whether it's mobilized to march, whether it's mobilized to complain to the public broadcaster. When that happens, it changes the balance of forces. And I think that that's where we're failing dismally, whether you look at the conventional media or social media.
Thank you so much to our panel. We're going to take another quick break and we'll be back after this.
Searching for elite local and international investment and advisory services from an award-winning firm? Look no further than the Belmont Meyer Group, your gateway to unparalleled investment and wealth management. At Belmont Meyer, we believe in the art of wealth creation, a meticulous process fueled by our unwavering commitment to excellence. With a focus on providing elite alternative investments and quality advice, we also pride ourselves on maximizing value for our esteemed investors, as seen through our consistent outperformance. Your financial success is our top priority. Join us at Belmont Meyer and experience the difference firsthand. Ready to embark on a journey of greatness? Contact us today. Reach out to the Belmont Meyer Group on 078 786 1698. Call or WhatsApp or email us at info@belmontmeyer.com. Elevate your financial future with Belmont Meyer, where every detail matters.
Discover the Africa of your dreams and surround yourself with her spectacular beauty. Relax beneath her serene sunsets and explore wildlife at its natural best. It's where the pride of Africa comes together. The Kwantu Private Game Reserve. Get to know the Big Five or cruise on an elephant safari game drive. Interact with lion and tiger cubs and enjoy world-class halal cuisine while we pamper you during your 5-star stay. Indulge in the true African experience. For reservations, call now on 042-203-1400 or visit kwantu.co.za. The Kwantu Private Game Reserve, the place of gathering.
After the recent attacks on Gaza, many families have been displaced with their homes left destroyed. Through your donations, our teams are on the ground in Gaza, providing support and delivering necessary aid to families affected. The people of Gaza need your help. Give hope. Donate today to Penny Appeal South Africa. www.pennyappeal.org.za 031 1100 573.
We are here on the ground with Penny Appeal organizations in Gaza.
Shimmer, sparkle, captivate. Nothing less than a masterpiece. Droplets of gold inspires precious design. Platinum bursts with intricate freshness. And every pure diamond becomes more than just a girl's best friend. Voda Gold Gem Jewelers, where timeless dreams become a reality. Come to us. We tailor-make designer gold, platinum, and diamond jewelry. Trade in or remodel your old gold. Clad yourself with classy name-branded watches. We offer insurance valuation and free zakat calculation. Visit us at 534 Ridge Road, Overport, or call 031 208 9142. Voda Gold Gem Jewelers, manufacturers of fine gold and diamond jewelry.
Conveniently located along the banks of the Crocodile River bordering the Kruger National Park, as a guest at Buckler's Africa Lodge, one can enjoy an amazing sunrise or sunset on our spacious deck area while you catch a glimpse of some wildlife sightings along the Crocodile River. The sounds of the African savannah will greet you whilst you enjoy your morning coffee. Buckler's Africa Lodge by Tingana Collection. Buckler's Africa Lodge is ideally situated only 6 kilometers from the Crocodile Bridge Gate in the Kruger National Park. Catering for all travelers with variety, we have 4 types of the finest rooms: superior rooms, deluxe suites, and 2-bedroomed family units. Each room is equipped with the finest amenities to make your stay unforgettable. Guests can choose between the self-catering option or book their accommodation with breakfast and dinner included. Buckler's Africa Lodge is your ideal location for the ultimate Kruger getaway experience. We specialize in exhilarating and educational game drives in Kruger, tailor-made to suit your family. Inquire about our various accommodation offerings and other activities. Visit www.tingana.co.za for more information. Buckler's Africa Lodge by Tingana Collection. Experience the pulse of Africa with us.
Listen to something fresh. Listen to Salam Media.
Okay, welcome back to Salam Media and our discussion on the foreign influence on South African media and NGOs. We're in our last 10 minutes now, and I just wanted to talk about the conference that's coming up. We did touch a bit about it at the outset, and that's the World Movement for Democracy Conference that's going to be held between the 20th and the 22nd of November at the Freedom Park on the first day, and then at the Sandton Convention Center. Roscoe, could you perhaps give us an understanding about what this conference is supposed to do and why foundations like the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation would actually be engaging in participating in something like this?
Thank you. I wish more world-class artists and musicians would come and fewer regime change operations. We have become conference town. So let's start for some back. We have to know that the National Endowment for Democracy is a regime change operation of the United States. That is a fact. That's their stated objective: promote soft power. And in fact, like in Nicaragua in 1990, they assisted it led to the overthrow of that government. It was lauded by the National Endowment for Democracy in a report to Congress where Carl Gershwin called it one of the greatest achievements of the National Endowment for Democracy. Of late, we've had the Brentis Foundation has given a conference between the 23rd and the 23rd of March at Parliament. It was the Brentis Foundation is the Oppenheimer's plaything to influence Africa and South African politics. So the attendees were John Steenhuisen, among others. There was Jordan Neal Lewis, and also one of the co-hosts was the World Liberty Congress, the head who moves cryptocurrency across borders. In fact, one of his programs, as stated in his YouTube videos, is to train 1,000 trainers to move cryptocurrency. The World Liberty Congress is founded by the National Endowment for Democracy. Also attending that conference was the editor Branko Berkish of the Daily Maverick. Then we had this thing that Ivor Chipkin, this Zionist washing conference that he tried to pull at Constitution Hill. It was he said it was about narrative conditions for peace in the Middle East, but these things are always about narrative. It's never about the actual genocide. He claimed it to be an all sides thing, but there's no all siding in a genocide, especially when Ivor Chipkin used Tony Leon's Resolve Communications to have direct input into the speaker's notes. Paul Bowie himself gave input into the speaker's notes, and I saw Ivor Chipkin crying in the Mailing Garden about the collapse of this conference. No one's going to begrudge him a living, but I think to make a party with like naked genocide, I don't think. Now we have this National Endowment for Democracy thing happening. So South Africa has become conference town, and I think if you think how influence operations were done in the 90s or in the 80s, it's completely different. Now we can have cryptocurrency, we can have these conferences. And I think it's right that that organizations are now pulling out of it, because the National Endowment for Democracy has a playbook where they use NGOs, they use media. For example, in Nicaragua, they use the publication La Prensa in much the same way that you can think of it as the Daily Maverick of its time. Although it wasn't completely responsible for the entire overthrow of a government, it contributed to the conditions which facilitated or rather lubricated the thing. So I think we have to be very careful. And NGOs that make common cause with the National Endowment of Democracy, they have to know what they're signing up for, and that is to be complicit in a regime change operation and to undermine the legitimacy of our government, just like it's done in governments all over the world.
Angelo, you coming from the NGO background yourself, I mean, how does a foundation like the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation, how do they justify being part of something like this? Can one really say that it's funding, we're desperate for funding, or we will be able to influence the narrative? We actually have the ability to influence the narrative.
So I'm not going to speak on behalf of the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation. I've read the Defend Our Democracy statement, in which they suggest that they want to engage at this forum precisely on the Palestine question. I think it is important to follow the money and ask where does the money come from, and also to ask what influence the money has. But it's also important to think very carefully about being alarmed and making alarms about regime change if the conditions for such potential regime change do not exist. So you cannot induce insecurity in states that are fairly secure. So while the NED and the CIA have attempted to influence a whole variety of states, Nicaragua could be influenced precisely because of the nature of inequality and instability of its institutions, but Sweden could not be influenced to the same extent. And we need to take some responsibility as South Africans for engendering a state that was open to this because of poor regulation, poor construction of state institutions, compromising of those state institutions by, among other things, cadre deployment. And so I'm, aware that, yes, one needs to be very careful about choosing where you take your money from and who's, he who pays the piper calls the tune, whose tune you are dancing to. But at the same time, NGOs in South Africa have had to play a role precisely because of government failure. If it were not for Section 27, we would know nothing, if not even less than nothing, about the Life Isidimeni tragedy. The families of the Marikana miners who died would not have access to this. We would have an even bigger social housing crisis on our hands if it weren't for the Socioeconomic Rights Institute. Our education system would be in total disarray if equal education was not just antagonistically, but cooperatively working with the Department of Basic Education to get norms and standards sorted and deal with textbooks and other resource allocations. And so we are a state where we have done internal failures that are ripe for the picking by outsiders keen to reduce us back to an extractive economy. We need to not just build a bulwark against those outsiders, we also need to fix some of our internal problems. And so deepening democracy in South Africa will include improving the literacy and critical literacy of its citizenry, improving the education outcomes, and not just improving the menu of what people can consume in their media, and also making the NGOization, as Arundhati Roy calls it in India, in South Africa, needless, precisely because the state government is delivering what it is supposed to, and non-state actors, NGOs, don't have to agitate government or worse, do the work for it. And that, I think, is the political economy in which AKF's decisions and the DOD's decisions must be read. But that doesn't mean that they shouldn't still be held accountable for their choices.
Well, thank you so much, gentlemen, for this really stimulating conversation. And we hope to have you back on Salam Media, looking at issues that affect the mediascape and everything South African. Thank you so much and have a good evening. Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam.